Yo, what is going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. So yesterday, I made a fun video recapping the Wild 2021 draft day, and on that, there were four massively lopsided blockbusters before the draft, that being the Rasmus Ristolainen, the Pavel Buchnevich, Oliver Ekman-Larsson, and Seth Jones trades. One team tried to be aggressive and win now or dump a guy, and it worked out horrendously for those teams. So I thought it'd be a fun idea for all of us to come together and relive our trauma, and now I'm going to go through every single team's worst trade of the last 5 years. That's how far Puckpedia would allow me to go. They're not cap friendly quite yet. They don't have like the last 15 years, like the entire goddamn salary cap era of trades. So we are going to get into it. And up first, I'm going to relive my own trauma with Devon Toews trade. He was, of course, traded to the Colorado Avalanche for 2 second-round picks, would go on to sign a deal at like $3.8 million with the Colorado Avalanche, go on to win a Stanley Cup, have 188 points in 281 games. As for my New York Islanders, they got 2 second-round picks. They ended up using one of those second-round picks to dump Andrew Ladd. Like a season later, they should have just dumped Andrew Ladd instead of trading goddamn Devon Toews. So it was brutal for them. Devon Toews quickly developed into a top 15, arguably top 10 defenseman in the entire NHL. And don't get me wrong, he would have never developed the same way. For the New York Islanders, we had Pelech and Polak, who were amazing. Noah Dobson coming up, but we would have had by far the best top four. We probably arguably did at the time, but we would have had by far the best top four in the entire NHL in 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024. It was brutal by Lou Lamoriello to not move out some other contracts to make some room for Devon Toews, clearly our worst trade of the last 5 years. For the St. Louis Blues, I'm going to go with one of their 2023 deadline deals, not Tarasenko, not Ryan O'Reilly. I thought they did pretty solid with those. I'm going to go when they traded Ivan Barbashev to the Vegas Golden Knights for Zachary Dean. Zachary Dean was a former first-round pick, I believe, in 2021. He went 30th overall, but when looking at his development, the fact that they decided to trade for him instead of, say, a first or 2 second-round picks, Zach Dean only had 14 points in 45 AHL games at this point, so they opted maybe for the guy that's in his draft year +1, draft year +2, but at this point, it's looking like they got a non-NHLer for a pretty solid second-line winger. Pretty big disappointment in terms of the St. Louis Blues kicking off their rebuild with one of those trades that didn't really work out at this point. The Edmonton Oilers, I'm going to go with the Duncan Keith trade. It was Duncan Keith for Caleb Jones and a third-round pick, and although the Oilers did make the conference finals that following year, it wasn't really because of Duncan Keith. Duncan Keith at that point was a third-pairing defenseman that was making $5.5 million. They didn't even get any salary retention on this deal, so that 5.5 could have been used far better. Not saying they would have beaten the Colorado Avalanche, but they could have used that salary cap for a guy that would have been on the team for multiple years. Instead of Duncan Keith, who ended up retiring shortly after, they went for the veteran leader, but at that point, he just was a shell of himself. There's no denying that, so that was pretty disappointing for the Edmonton Oilers. For the Pittsburgh Penguins, it's got to be when they traded Jared McCann to the Toronto Maple Leafs for a 7th-round pick in Philip Hollander. This was right before the expansion draft, I believe. But yeah, McCann was coming off a season where he had 32 points in 43 games in 2021, and he quickly developed into a fantastic first-line winger. When looking at it in 2023, the guy had 40 points. They got an okay prospect and a 7th-round pick. Of course, the Toronto Maple Leafs would go on to not protect Jared McCann. But yeah, the Seattle Kraken really benefited from this. Even though they weren't in the trade, they ended up benefiting from it. And Pittsburgh probably should have held on to Jared McCann. For the Florida Panthers, there's a couple of choices here. They traded Frank Vatrano for a 4th-round pick. They traded away Mike Matheson before he really broke out. But for me personally, their worst trade is still the Ben Chiarot deal. When looking at it, they gave up a 1st-round pick at the 2023 deadline, and Chiarot just did absolutely nothing for them. He played 17 minutes a night, played 10 playoff games, only had 1 point, really got caved in against the Tampa Bay Lightning, and as a result, the Florida Panthers ended up getting swept in the 1st round. For the Chicago Blackhawks, I'm not going to spend too much time on it because it was in yesterday's video, but it's clearly the Seth Jones trade. They got Seth Jones, Noah Allen, who was the 32nd overall pick in the 2021 draft, for Adam Boqvist, the 12th overall that turned into Sillinger, a 2021 second that they traded for Jake Bean, and a 2022 first-round pick that turned into David Jiricek. For Calgary, it's the Huberdeau deal, mainly because of the Huberdeau extension, but still the trade itself is very disappointing. Huberdeau, Weegar, a 2025 first-round pick, and Cole Schwindt for Matthew Tkachuk. Matthew Tkachuk quickly proved that 2022 is no fluke. He's a legit top 12 player in the entire NHL. Huberdeau fell off a cliff. Mackenzie Weegar is still very solid, but this kind of propelled the Calgary Flames into a goddamn rebuild, and rightfully so. For Montreal, it has to be kind of the reactionary trade that they made after the Kotkaniemi offer sheet. They gave up a 1st and a 2nd-round pick for Christian Dvorak. Dvorak on Montreal has not lived up to that price that they paid. Granted, it was Carolina's first. It wasn't some extremely high first for Montreal, but still, he had 33 points in 58 games in his first season, then 28 in 64, and then 9 in 30. He was basically a bottom sixer last year. Not good for the Montreal Canadiens. It was Bergevin really just reaching, trying to stay competitive after making the Stanley Cup final. For the Nashville Predators, I'm going to go with the Mattias Ekholm deal. Not a disastrous deal by any point, but when looking at the fact that they gave up Ekholm, who has been like a top 15, arguably, defenseman for the Edmonton Oilers since arriving, they only got Tyson Barrie, Reed Schaefer, who was a former first-round pick that has not really panned out, a 2023 first-round pick that they ended up using on Tanner Mollendijk, but still pretty disappointing for a guy like Ekholm, a legit top-pairing defenseman that was on a very good contract with like 3 or 4 years left at around $6 million. They probably should have got more when you look at the market rate for legit top-pair two-way guys, and especially a guy as good defensively as Ekholm. It's definitely a little bit disappointing. Not the end of the world if that's your worst trade, though. For the Tampa Bay Lightning, this is a pretty devastating trade when they traded for Tanner Jeannot at the 2023 deadline. They gave up a 2025 first-round pick, so that's still in play this year, a 2024 second-round pick, a 2023 third-round pick, a 2023 fourth-round pick, a 2023 fifth-round pick for Tanner Jeannot. Tanner Jeannot did not work out on the Tampa Bay Lightning. He ended up just basically being a bottom sixer for them, and then he was flipped this year at the draft. Somehow they got like a second and a fourth round pick for him, but to give up basically a full year of a draft board for Tanner Jeannot, who had a very good rookie year, but even when he was traded at the time for Tampa Bay, it didn't make any sense, and it is one of the worst deals of the last 3 to 5 years. No doubt. For the Vegas Golden Knights, I'm going to go with the Washington Capitals trade that they made for Logan Thompson. 2 third-round picks for Logan Thompson. I was pretty shocked by this. Not that Logan Thompson has this long track record. You look at a Jacob Markstrom, clearly more proven, but the fact that Logan Thompson was making $760,000 next year, the fact that they weren't able to get 2 seconds, a second and a third, a first-round pick for a guy that is so cost-controlled next season, not that good of a deal for them. For the San Jose Sharks, this is another Vegas goalie trade, but it was when they traded Adin Hill to the Vegas Golden Knights for only a fourth-round pick. Clearly gave up on him a little bit too early, and now Adin Hill has developed into around a very solid starter, around the top 15 to 20 goalie in the NHL. For the Carolina Hurricanes, I'm going to go with the Max Pacioretty deal. Not saying that you could have assumed that he was going to tear his Achilles, but it clearly did not work out. Even though they traded him for nothing, they traded away future considerations. They burnt like $7 million in cap space as a result of acquiring Max Pacioretty. For the New York Rangers, clearly Pavel Buchnevich for Sammy Blais and a second-round pick. Buchnevich has been around point per game his first 2 seasons in St. Louis, and even last year, still 63 points. For the Ottawa Senators, it has to be when they tried to fix their goalie position. Hopefully the Ullmark deal doesn't go like this. When they traded a second-round pick to get Matt Murray, he had an 893 and then a 906 in just 47 games. For the Ottawa Senators, clearly did not work. Then they had to attach a third and a fifth-round pick just to end up dumping him. The Dallas Stars, I hated this deal in the moment, but when they traded for Nils Lundkvist and gave up a 2023 third-round pick and a 2025 conditional fourth-round pick, Nils Lundkvist was completely unproven at the NHL level, and he wasn't even that high of a first-round pick. I believe back in 2018, he was a late first-round pick. Amazing asset management by the New York Rangers in this situation. The Anaheim Ducks, I wasn't really able to find any like bad trades. So I just went when they traded Daniel Sprong for Christian Djoos. I don't, that's like the worst one. Sprong ended up being a pretty solid middle sixer. For the LA Kings, it is clearly the Pierre-Luc Dubois trade. This is a bottom 5 trade of the last 5 years without a doubt, considering the fact that it was a sign and trade. It wasn't even like a Huberdeau trade where they negotiated the extension after. They knew that they were getting him at 8 years, $8.5 million. Just absolutely brutal. The full package was Gabe Vilardi, and if you just stop the package there, it's not worth it, considering Gabe Vilardi made like half of what PLD did last year and was the far better player, but also Rasmus Kupari, Alex Iafallo, decent middle 6 piece, and a second-round pick that ended up being 37th overall from the Montreal Canadiens that they used to select Alphonse Frey. Just brutal for the LA Kings. They already moved off Pierre-Luc Dubois and basically just capped their ceiling as yet again a wild card, considering they missed so much on this goddamn trade. For the Washington Capitals, it has to be when they traded. It's actually reverse. Vegas's worst trade was them trading to Washington. Washington's worst trade is trading to Vegas because they gave up Chandler Stevenson for a 5th-round pick. Yes, maybe Chandler Stevenson does not develop the same way in Washington, but Chandler Stevenson for a 5th-round pick, the fact that he turned into around the 60-point guy in 2022 and 2023, and even this year, around 51 points, won a Stanley Cup, big part of their Stanley Cup winning team in 2023, an absolute fleece by the Vegas Golden Knights. For the Winnipeg Jets, I'm going to go when they acquired Nate Schmidt for a 3rd-round pick. Not a massive price to pay, but Nate Schmidt had like 3 years left. at around $6 million. And as a result, he didn't really live up to that. He was a bottom pairing guy the last 2 years, and they had to buy him out. So clearly, giving up any assets for a guy that ended up being a negative value player for your team to the point where you had to literally buy him out, very disappointing for the Winnipeg Jets. The Philadelphia Flyers went over it yesterday. Rasmus Ristolainen, 14th overall, which ended up being Isaac Rosen, a 2023 second-round pick that ended up being Anton Wahlberg, and Robert Hagg for a guy that eats a lot of minutes, throws out a lot of hits, but isn't that good of a defenseman at the end of the day. Very bad by Chuck Fletcher in the Philadelphia Flyers. The Utah Hockey Club, I'm going to go with when they went like all in to get Taylor Hall. When looking at it, it was Taylor Hall and Blake Spears for Kevin Ball, Nate Schnarr, Nicholas Merkley, and then that 2020 first-round pick ended up being Dawson Mercer. That's a pretty solid piece that ended up being like 16th or 17th, 18th overall. The fact that Arizona went so aggressive, was willing to trade some of their assets. I believe that they made the playoffs that year, but then lost in the first round. It was the bubble playoffs, so like doesn't really even count. They went aggressive, ended up not working out. And if this team had Dawson Mercer, imagine how much even more loaded their future forward core would be. I respect them being aggressive, but clearly it did not really work out considering they didn't re-sign Taylor Hall or do anything serious in the playoffs. Vancouver Canucks, pretty easily the OEL deal as well. I talked about it yesterday. OEL and Garland for Louis Eriksson, Jay Beagle, Antoine Roussel, a 2022 second-round pick and a 2021 first-round pick that ended up turning into Dylan Guenther. Not that much explanation needed there. For the Detroit Red Wings, it's a deal that Yzerman made this summer, in my opinion, when he dumped Jake Wallman on and attached a second-round pick just to dump him for some reason to the San Jose Sharks to not really do much in terms of alter his defense score that much. Just didn't like it. I get that Jake Wallman maybe isn't what he was in 2023 anymore, where he was a legit top pair guy, but he was only making like $3.5 million. The fact that you had to attach a second-round pick, and reports came out that other teams, like he didn't even reach out to a lot of the teams to gauge the interest. He just did this deal. Not that good by the Detroit Red Wings. Next up for the New Jersey Devils, I have the Jake Allen trade from this year's deadline. They traded a third-round pick to get him, and yes, he is half retained, but I still don't think Jake Allen's that good of a goalie. At this point, they probably could have just spent $2 million on a backup or made some kind of other trade for a backup, so I'm not too high on that deal. Not a disastrous trade by any stretch. For the Buffalo Sabres, though, it's got to be Brandon Montour. They traded him away for only a third-round pick. He clearly went to Florida and became an absolute stud, had like 73 points, and last year won the Stanley Cup. And it's pretty bad asset management, especially when you consider back in 2019, they traded for Montour and gave up a first-round pick to get him. For the Minnesota Wild, it's got to be when at the deadline they traded for Marcus Johansson from the Washington Capitals for a 2024 third-round pick. He had 14 points in 36 regular season games, 0 points in 3 playoff games, a deadline acquisition that kind of just absolutely shat the pants. Toronto Maple Leafs, this one's going to haunt them a decent amount. When they traded for Dennis Malgin and gave up Mason Marchment. Mason Marchment would go on to play fantastic for the Florida Panthers. And then after a bit of a down year, first season in Dallas, this year yet again was around 50-ish points. Malgin, bottom sixer, AHLer for the most part, to give up Mason Marchment. That definitely stinks. The Colorado Avalanche, I'm going to go when they traded for Ryan Johansson last summer. Yes, it even was half retained, but after a decent goal scoring start from Johansson, he was brutal for them. He was so brutal that they ended up having to like dump him to the Philadelphia Flyers. Like, yes, Philly got a first round pick for Sean Walker, but a lot of that had to do with the fact that they were dumping another year of Ryan Johansson next season. And now that's a whole goddamn debate whether he's actually hurt or not. But moving on to the Seattle Kraken, and similarly to Anaheim, this isn't like a horrible deal by any stretch, but when looking at it, they only got a 4th-round pick from Mason Appleton, who's a perfectly fine middle sixer, good third liner, had 36 points for Seattle. Then we got the Boston Bruins, and I'm going to go with their recent deal of Linus Ullmark to the Ottawa Senators for Korpisalo, Mark Kastelik, in a 2024 first-round pick. Maybe Dean Letourneau really pans out, but in terms of value, the fact that they only got 25% retained on Korpisalo for Ullmark, who is still at a perfectly reasonable $5 million next season, and now they're dealing with that Jeremy Swayman contract negotiation, not looking good right now for the Boston Bruins, and Ottawa really took advantage of them. And then lastly, for the Columbus Blue Jackets, I have the Ivan Provorov trade. And although they got Provorov at 30%, which isn't like he's an okay player at that cap hit, they gave up the 22nd overall pick, ended up being Oliver Bonk, a conditional 2024 second-round pick that's now a 2025 second-round pick. And yeah, they're just so far away from winning that I'm sure Don Waddell would wipe that off the slate, considering the fact that Jarmo Kakalainen made this trade there. They should not have been buying so aggressive in that 2023 offseason. It was clearly Kakalainen trying to keep his job, and now they're set to be one of the worst teams the next 2 to 3 years. But yeah, that's every single team's worst trade in the last 5 years. Don't think I'm really forgetting everybody. Anyone. I combed over Puckpedia, but let me know if there's any ones that you think are in the contendership for worst trade by every single team. I'm going to start rolling out my division preview predictions, standings predictions over the next couple of days. So get ready for that. I'll be seeing you in the next one.